Hello, teachers, and welcome back to episode 4 of our series on strongmen and democracy. And we are glad to have you back with us for this series and talking and teaching about democracy and dictators. And I have with me today Kenneth C. Davis, who is the author of Strongman, The Rise of Five Dictators and the Fall of Democracy. My name is Jessica Ellison, and I'm a teacher educator at the Minnesota Historical Society. And we are so pleased to have you with us. And today for episode 4, we are going to talk about Mao Zedong of China. And the title of this episode is The Long March. And what you might see here on the screen might seem like the exact same image, but we're going to talk a little bit later about how to really look closely at primary sources to pick out small things that might be different. But before we get to these primary sources, let's have a conversation with Ken about Mao Zedong. So I'm going to stop sharing and we're going to chat with Ken. Hi, Ken. How are you?
Hello, Jessica. A pleasure to be with you as always, although this is not a very pleasurable topic. It's an important one and we have to think about it. I was reading the news this morning, and of course we are now well past the number of more than 300,000 American people dead. And we're starting to get to that point, I think, where maybe we passed it long ago. We're a little bit numb to numbers. And that's a dangerous thing, both in terms of this pandemic and how it's affecting us, but also in terms of discussing this subject, because we get into these numbers of millions of people being killed or murdered or starved to death. And it's very easy to think of these simply as numbers, as statistics, but they're not. They're all people. In fact, in the book, Strongman, I quote Stalin, who we spoke about earlier. A quote attributed to him is that one death is a tragedy, a million deaths is a statistic. And that's an important idea for us all to think about as we're talking about this subject, because all of these men who did such brutal things and the people who assisted them, their accomplices, they took millions of lives, human lives. This is a story of real people. And so it's very important, I think, for teachers and all of us to remember that we should not be numb to these catastrophic numbers, whether it's in our own time, in our own lives, or historically.
Yes, absolutely. And understanding individual stories humanizes the story and really ensures that, like you said, we think about people as individuals and not just numbers. Certainly we see this with the study of slavery as well. So
absolutely. And just calling to mind again the news, because I'm always reading the news and connecting it to history. One of the many sad stories of real people that I read recently, and a woman in Italy, and I have a love for all things Italian, died of the COVID the other day. She was 96, I believe, and her biography, her obituary actually was quite extraordinary, because she had been a partisan fighter in Italy during World War II. So she battled both Mussolini and the fascists and the Nazis who were in Germany, allied with the Italians. She battled them through the war, but ultimately falls to COVID. But a reminder of how close we are to the story of these dictators. We were talking about Mussolini and Hitler, of course, and this woman's somewhat poignant obituary story of her death by COVID after surviving fascism and Nazism was especially poignant to me.
Well, and speaking of how close we are to history, as we're moving through the 20th century and moving into the era of Mao Zedong, we get even closer to a time where that's in memory of people living today. So do you want to talk a little bit about Mao and how he came to power in China?
Absolutely. Mao Zedong was born in the late part of the 19th century, in the 1890s. came of age as a young boy at a moment when China was being transformed, essentially. This ancient civilization ruled for hundreds, thousands of years by emperors, by dynasties, one after another, and for much of its history cut off from the outside world in many respects. Of course, this was the civilization that built a wall to keep out foreigners. But by the beginning of the 20th century, when Mao Zedong is growing up, a boy on a rice farm, basically, his father was not a peasant by any means. He actually was a rather successful businessman who owned enough property that he rented out properties to other farmers. So Mao's father did not come out of the poverty that some other of these leaders came from. And that's an interesting perspective. But from a very, very early age, something of a rebel. And one of the best examples of that, I think, is the fact that when he was 14, he, like many children of his age, young men and women in China, his parents arranged a marriage for him. Think about it. Those 8th and 9th graders that you might teach being put into an arranged marriage. And this was a young woman who was a little bit older than him, and Mao, remarkably for a Chinese boy of 14, balked at this arranged marriage, even though it was actually officially a marriage. He was legally married at 14 under Chinese laws and traditions, but he resisted it. And I guess it showed just the rebellious streak that was eventually going to emerge. But it's really at this moment in Chinese history that the empire falls apart. The last emperor abdicates the throne. For a very, very brief moment, there is a republic in China, a republic that is going to be a democratic republic led by a rather famous figure in Chinese history named Dr. Sun Yat-sen. Ultimately, however, civil war breaks out between those who want a communist government led by Mao and his colleagues, and those who were looking to do a more nationalistic, militaristic government led by a man named Chiang Kai-shek. And this would be a civil war that would divide China for decades, really, until World War II comes and the Japanese invade. And once the Japanese come into China, the two different forces in China come together to battle the Japanese. Once World War II is over, it's back to civil war. And finally, in 1949, the communists are successful. They defeat the nationalist military. And this is a war that went on for decades with millions and millions of lives lost. Of course, China was already the most populous nation on the face of the earth. But in 1949, Chairman Mao, as he was known, the great helmsman, becomes the undisputed leader of China and its millions of people, and would bring China into the modern world.
So then when we're talking about this point then in history, this is post World War II, post Civil War in China. When we looked at the other dictators, the people of these countries were looking for stability. They were looking for economic safety, etc. Did that apply also here?
Absolutely, because the mass numbers of Chinese people lived in abject poverty. This was a civilization, as I said, a civilization of thousands of years of tradition that had kept these people in their place with a single authority at the top. So in some ways, China was more ready, I suppose, for a strongman leader, because that had been the entirety of its history. Whereas, some of the other countries we've talked about had a little bit of democratic tradition or beginnings of democracy to fall back on. But this was the place where the real idea of the working class people, the peasants, the poor, rising up to take control was going to be brought to reality. In some respects, as it had in Russia under Stalin. And Stalin was a very, very active supporter of Chairman Mao early on. He saw China as this great potential for an alliance between the Soviet Union and its Asian neighbor, China. So Stalin was very, very influential in arming the Chinese Communist Party. So there's a real strong connection between those two that I also describe in the book a little bit. But of course, when we come to this idea of creating a workers' paradise, this was an idea and perhaps a propaganda that never came to be. It was not going to be a paradise for most people in China because Mao was going to do what Stalin had done also, to try and bring China into the world as a global power, a global industrial power, military power, and eventually a nuclear power. And he accomplishes all those things at enormous cost to the people of China. His moves to industrialize the country, to take land from anyone who owned it and turn it over to state ownership was disastrous. For the most part, led to massive starvation in several points in China's history. So this is a brutal regime that also enforced its power with secret police, the oppression of any political opposition, complete control of the media. There was only the state newspaper would be allowed. So this was true totalitarianism on a massive scale that had, that of course changed the course of history. And for most of that time, China, Red China, as it was known when I was a child growing up, was a scary place. Red China and the masses, and of course the United States and Red China come into a direct conflict during the Korean War. North Korea was supported by the Chinese. The United States goes into Korea, and the China under Mao actually sends troops into North Korea. So this was a very hot part of the Cold War and a very, very dangerous moment in American history. It was the moment at which there were generals, serious generals, contemplating the use of an atomic weapon against North Korea and the Chinese. Dwight D. Eisenhower, the president at the time, opposed that completely, but it was a very, very tenuous moment for the world during in the 1950s. And then remarkably, we get to this moment, and you talk about living through history. I remember this history so well because I was now a teenager, actually in college at the time it happened, that Richard Nixon, the most fervent anti-communist president in American history, goes to China and meets Chairman Mao. It was an extraordinary moment. I describe it in the book. It was the result of what was known as ping pong diplomacy. Some Americans went to China to play ping pong in a tournament. They actually met in Japan first, and they're invited to come to China. And this one meeting really becomes the beginning of a diplomatic relationship that has changed modern history. There's no question about that. And we can only look at what has happened in China since that meeting in the 1970s. The last 50 years have been extraordinary.
So that's a long period of time. We're talking the late 1940s to the 70s. Is that what you refer to when you call it the Long March?
The Long March is a very specific reference to the most famous thing that Mao did to cement his stature in the Chinese history and mythology. The Long March was actually a true march of hundreds of thousands of Chinese soldiers and peasants during the Civil War with the nationalists. The Nationalist Army was about to encircle and defeat the Red Army, the Communist Red Army, and Mao wills these people in this remarkable march across mountains in the winter to escape the Nationalists. And hundreds of thousands of people die during this march, but it's seen as the signal event that saves the Red Army and ultimately leads to defeat of the Nationalists. And it's this moment that Mao takes and makes himself the unquestioned leader of the Communist Party. And in doing that, he elevates himself to mythical stature. And this again becomes this part of how we get the cult of personality. There were songs written for Mao. There were posters of him leading the marchers in the Long March. So this really established him as the central figure in Chinese modern history and would continue to be glorified for the next 50 years.
So as we've
But it was a long march of history as well, to
yeah.
finish the point.
So it's literal and figurative.
Yes, absolutely.
So as we've talked about with the other dictators that we've discussed, what is the lesson that we can learn from Mao Zedong?
This is perhaps the most clear case I was just talking about the cult of personality, and I think that Mao may present the clearest case of a single person becoming the nation and the complete loyalty to this man. And it's perhaps best exemplified. This is not the book, but there was a little book called The Little Red Book, and it's about this size, which was quotations from Chairman Mao. And every Chinese person was to have a copy of this book and know it and recite it. And so just the way that many Christians from a very early age learn the 10 Commandments or the Lord's Prayer or something like that, or people in other cultures learn some specific religious, important religious tenets. Chinese people learned the quotations of Chairman Mao. And there was such unquestioning loyalty to him that this is, I think, perhaps the best example we can get as we talk about these strongman of what a cult of personality means and how dangerous it is, because there was complete and unquestioning loyalty to Mao. So if he spoke or issued a pronouncement, it had the complete force of law backed by millions of soldiers. And that would lead to things like the famous Cultural Revolution in the 1960s, where students across China rose up to get rid of what they called anti-revolutionary forces reactionary forces in China. So it's the extraordinary power that one man has when that cult of personality is created. And it was no more true than under Mao Zedong.
Well, and that's a really great segue into these primary sources that I pulled up to talk about how the cult of personality bleeds into not only the propaganda and the imagery, but also the reality of what happens when you do something to make the dictator mad. And so I'm gonna share my screen here, and we're gonna take a look at these two sources. So these are paintings that depict the beginning of the People's Republic of China. And so this was sort of the start. And there you can see Chairman Mao in the middle, and he's speaking, and there's a crowd of people behind him. There's about 20 years between these two images. And so the one on the left is the earlier version, and the one on the right is the later version. So look really close and try to see if you can pinpoint what the difference is. And this is a great activity you can do with your students if you've got two pieces that are remarkably similar upon first glance, but then different as you look closer, to talk about the reasons for those differences. So I'm going to point out a gentleman here. in the image on the left, so he is standing in the crowd on the very kind of far right behind the gentleman with the white beard. He's in that one. He's not in the other one. And he was deliberately removed from the later version because he fell from grace in the party. He dishonored the party and he eventually committed suicide. This is Gao Gang. And so that one small change is really indicative of what happens when you don't uphold the cult of personality. So this is just one example of some primary sources that you can use to talk about Mao Zedong, but really great activity you can apply elsewhere. So we're glad that you were able to join us again. And as always, we have this bit.ly with resources that you can jump into to get some more information. And it's bit.ly/S Strongman 2020. And please do send me an email if you have any questions at jessica.ellison@mnhs.org. Thanks again. We'll see you for the next episode.